Alright, welcome back to the rendering part of this tutorial, where I'm going to show you guys just a few steps in rendering in Painter 12 and using the palette that I created in here. This first brush is called the flat rendering marker, and I created it just to basically lay down flat colors for your design. There's no opacity or anything in the marker. It's just a flat, opaque marker, basically. It almost works more like laying down gouache paint. So I'm going to go through here and just fill in the kind of the gray areas of the sketch. It's basically all the mechanical pieces that are all this kind of dark gray. Just laying all the detailed part just to kind of give myself a base right now, and again, you know, very similar technique to the same technique I use in Photoshop. So as I move along here, I'm thinking about where I'm going to be putting my highlights and my dark areas, and you know, and I talked about this before in Photoshop, that when I'm going through this process of actually coloring in stuff, I'm thinking about the details and lighting and how the stuff is going to look. And now I'm going to go ahead and put in my a base tone, kind of just a background for the car to sit on. And I'm going to use what's called the flat rendering marker 2. And what's on this one that's different than the flat rendering marker is this one has the transparency to it, so you can kind of see the strokes underneath it. You know, it acts more like a real marker would. You know, as you build up the tones, that it has some transparency to it every time you lay it down. And when I'm laying down these strokes, I'm thinking about the design a little bit. I'm just adding it in a dynamic way to accent the vehicle and the stance that it has going. Not spending a lot of time doing the background, but just enough to give it some dynamic look and kind of to fill in some areas. You know, mostly the wheels. I end up coloring most of the object in, or most of the vehicle in. So I'll add a little bit darker tones to it just for some variation. And this is a similar technique I would use a lot of times when I was using markers. You lay down some, you know, your strokes are kind of dynamic, and here I go in and I realize that the marker was kind of bleeding through, so it actually darkened up those areas on the mechanical details. So I actually use the darker tones as the edges, and then I just erase the top for where the light was hitting the mechanical details. So now I'm back to using the flat rendering marker, and I'm going to lay in my base tone for the main body of the vehicle, and just using this kind of a grayish blue color. And I know later on, when I figure out my colors too, I don't just throw down a color that I just thought of. A little bit of what I was thinking of when I laid this down was, I'm always inspired by racing. So the colors here are going to be loosely based on the old golf racing color scheme. You know, that kind of like that baby blue and orange. It's always one of my favorite racing scheme color combinations. But this one has kind of a gray blue instead of that baby blue. So I was thinking of I'm probably going to add orange to it later. Don't know where yet, but I'll figure it out as I move along. So I'm going back in there and erasing those areas again. And you can see I've left my line sketch fairly dark at this point. Later on, as I move through the rendering, I start to get rid of the I start to lighten the line drawing, so it's so the rendering actually takes over, and there's really no line drawing left. And this is just this is another style technique. And when I render my stuff, I tend to eventually lose the line drawing, just because it has a it ends up making the object look a little more solid, and it has weight, and that it could exist in the real world. There's nothing wrong with leaving your line drawing either. You know, if you want to, like at this point, if I needed to turn something over to a client or something, I could, because it has the line drawing there to kind of fill in areas that I haven't been able to render yet. And then earlier you saw me use a soft airbrush to kind of fill in the shadow areas of the car. So now I'm going in and kind of defining the wheels, and I'm treating those wheels when I add the dark core areas as basically a cylinder. So you have the core going right through the middle of the wheel, the darkest area, and then obviously the top of the areas, or the top of the wheel, is going to be the lightest. So just adding some quick definition. At this point, I'm starting to group my layers together, just to keep my layers over there fairly simple and clean, so that I'm not rendering in, or so I'm not having so many layers to where I can't find stuff. So here's where my orange comes in. I decided to color the wheels orange, and you saw me use a real heavily saturated orange in the beginning, and then I decided to calm that orange down a little bit so it's not so saturated. And then even on the far wheel there, to give it some distance and space from the other wheel, I desaturate the color even more, so it's not quite as saturated of a tone. And that helps with pushing things more towards the background and away from the viewer. The less saturated an object will look, the further away it is from you. So now I'm going to start going in and defining the dark areas of, some of my details. And as you can see, I kind of move all over my sketch, defining different areas. And now I'm going to go in and go ahead and start putting some highlights on the body as well, and to give myself just some definition on that body, get some highlights on it and some dark areas. And I do that by using the glow brush in Painter. Is a really neat brush to use, and it works similar to the color dodge in Photoshop, but it's actually a little bit better because it picks up more of the color underneath. And so I just lightly hit that edge right there where a highlight would be hitting the edge of the where that body's wrapping around. Kind of testing some things out, figuring out what looks best. So here I really add, get a little bit brighter on top, and then going down, and there's that body has an edge to it. It wouldn't just come to a straight edge pretty much. It just looks a little incomplete if you don't have a rolled edge on there. So just adding some form to that front section. Adding the highlight. There's like a little area where that, almost like a tiny little fender that pops out over the top of the front suspension. Then I'm adding some highlight to that underbody area, almost like reflected light, where the light's bouncing back up onto the object, or bouncing back up onto the body. And anytime you look at cars, their highlights will, bounce back up into to the car, and it'll actually give it definition into the wheel wells or the bottom of the car. And again, this is just coming from a lot of observation, watching reflective objects and how things react to the environment. And so when you add little touches like that, it gives life to your sketch, so it looks a little more realistic versus it looking just like a drawing. So now you can see I'm starting to lighten my sketch up a little bit. In fact, what I ended up doing here is I flattened the sketch into all the stuff that I had rendered. And I did that so that I could start getting rid of the line sketch. But just plugging along, and like I said, I kind of move all over the sketch. I don't stay in one area and work it. And there's a few reasons that I work like that. One is to make sure that the whole design is coming together as a whole and not really messing with a certain detailed area. Because if you work in just a small area and you kind of work out from there, you realize you're like, wow, that needed to be changed by the time you get really far after you've detailed something out. So it's good to kind of work all over the object or the design that you're working on, so that you're not spending too much time in one area and realize, wow, that needs to be changed. And this allows me to kind of go back and forth and figure out what does need to be changed or if it needs to be changed. So right now what I'm doing, I ended up realizing that I needed some more brushes to play with here. So I opened up the general brush palette in Painter, and now I'm going to go in and add basically some softer airbrush hits for where the light's hitting. And you'll see me come back and erase this so it's not so airbrushy looking. So getting rid of that airbrush look by using a hard-edged eraser and getting rid of the overspray basically on there. And then adding some highlights to the top of that, to the top of the exhaust. So as you can see, I am starting to zoom in on, or not really zoom in, but detail out some areas. So at this point, I'm really starting to focus in on the mechanical details of that engine. And just hitting the edges with some highlights to really define some areas on that. Kind of when you've gotten past the point of hitting the highlights and the dark areas, then you kind of start hitting the edges with some of your brighter highlights, and it starts to define a lot of the edges, and you can kind of see where stuff's going to sit and how things are going to look. And it's always cool to, I mean, this is part of my style, is I like mechanical details, so I think it really interests the viewer to look at that stuff, so you can focus in on detailed areas and really punch them out and make them look really detailed just by adding highlights and dark areas. And it also kind of guides the eye through the vehicle design. So I kind of put a lot of details in that front section there and work them all the way back into the engine, and then I kind of let stuff fade out towards the rear. I don't really focus as much on the details back there, because I don't want to fully detail out the whole object. And again, this is just another style thing that I do, that I let stuff fade off towards the back. It's kind of a vignetting type of style. it actually creates a little interest that way, so that you're not detailing out every square inch on this thing, and you leave some to the viewer's imagination, and it creates interest that way too. So now I'm going in and darkening up the body just to give it a little more definition. So where that rolls down, it starts to get darker. Now I'm going to add some lighter areas to the top of the wheel. Make a slight hot spot there and on all the wheels all the way around. So again, I'm just using a top lighting on the design of this. And what I mean by top lighting is I made my light source shine from the top down. So it's directly shining down on top of all the surfaces. I don't have any type of sunset or low lighting or anything like that when I'm doing a design. That way you keep it simple for yourself as a designer. You don't have to think about where your light's coming from. Now if I draw this in a scene, like in racing on the desert or something like that, you know, obviously you're going to add some dynamic lighting to it to make the scene look, you know, better and a little more kind of cinematic, or, you know, more entertainment type style to it. So I finally got a brush that I really liked and wanted to use. It's sort of similar to the hard edge brush that I use in Photoshop. The way it lays down the color and stuff. So I finally got rid of my menu so that I could get in there and really start digging into the rendering. Now this front area here, I end up fighting with it a little bit. I never got really happy with it, but you know, I got it to the point where I was okay with it, I guess. You know, it's just kind of one of those things that I would probably revisit this design to redo a few things. But, you know, it serves its purpose, and it shows a lot of detail up front. So right now I'm just adding the highlights to, you know, the suspension areas, and adding the top light to where all the arms stick out, and then putting brighter highlights on the edges of the suspension where they wrap around. So just giving them some definition. I mean, really, it's fairly simple when you think about it, that you have the top surface, which is bright, and then you have the surface that bends down that's going to be, you know, a little darker. It's like going back to the rendering of the cube. If anybody's ever done that exercise or seen it out there. And so you have the different surfaces with the how everything's lit. So I'm just applying that principle to all the detail and the body and the tires and, you know, everything on here. It's that same principle. But the edges get the brightest highlight. And when you just hit those areas with that brightest highlight, it just starts to define it and gives a solid feeling to a lot of the stuff. You know, everything kind of has an edge. I mean, there are some things out there that are sharp edged, but most of the time everything's radius, whether it's casted or milled or whatever. You know, it's pretty. It's always got an edge, and when you hit those edges with the brightest highlight, it really defines the object you're trying to render or to design. So even over there on my suspension, I see some flaws and stuff, and I'm just going in and trying to rework some things and, you know, define it better for the final design. Zooming out, it really helps me to look at the overall design and how stuff is lit and how stuff is coming along. So now I'm going to go in and zoom in on some areas. This is kind of just some holes in the body where some of the stuff is peeking through. Maybe they're intake inlets, you know, for the engine below it. Maybe they're even just little tiny exhaust that's used by the ram air device that's in the front of the car. I don't know. But just a cool mechanical detail popping through the body. So now that I'm zooming in, now I can kind of define these areas a little bit better so they're not so rough. So just taking a look at it here. So again, you can see that I'm not just focusing in on one area. I'm still moving throughout the whole car, not spending too much time on one area. So now I'm going to work on the back just for a little bit. It needed some more detail underneath the cockpit area just to make it look like he could actually sit down inside that thing. So I'm going to start probably focusing in here on some of the detailed areas of the car. I'm starting to give a little more definition and a few more details going on. So right now I'm figuring out which brush I'd like to use here to go in and start detailing out some of the finer details of the engine area and the other, like the intake area and things like that. So right here, I'm just going to add some type of device that would be holding on the exhaust there. So it's kind of like a clamp or some type of a bracket that would be holding an engine component on. And I realized I went in there to finally detail that area, and I realized my resolution was too small. So. And I did that on purpose. I start out with a lower resolution, then I res up as I get into the finer details. And the reason that I do that is that so that the beginning process kind of is really quick, and then when I get into my finer details, I can go in and draw the stuff at a better detail. What I was trying to do there on top of that is actually create a piece that comes out and then has a slant down at the end of it, and my resolution was so low that I couldn't get that angle on there. One of the things about digital is that, you know, if you're too low of a res and you're trying to draw something with fine detail, it won't work because the pixels are too big, so you can't draw these fine details on there. So now that I res it up, I'm able to draw the fine details and go in there and really focus in on this area. And as you can see, I'm still leaving it fairly loose. A lot of times this is just, you know, I'm making this stuff up in my head. I'm not really looking at any reference, but, you know, it is adding, you know, looking at enough engines out there and enough mechanical details that there's so many components to an engine or you know, to man-made objects that have a lot of moving parts. They need brackets, they need belts, they need, you know, all kinds of stuff, you know, working to make this engine function. So just keeping that in mind while I'm drawing this stuff, to go in and put all these extra details that are really in an engine. They may not be the exact details, but you know that a lot of this stuff exists on an existing engine. So you kind of make some of the stuff up as you go along. And it's just part of your own visual library that you've got in your own head. And also, a lot of reference that I've collected. I've looked at a lot of engines throughout my life, and I've even rebuilt cars. So, I have that knowledge base of what mechanical stuff looks like and how it works. And if you want a really good education on mechanical stuff, go out and rebuild yourself a couple of engines. You'll you'll figure out a lot of stuff. And it's fun too. You get to learn a lot. But, just doing that has really helped me in drawing mechanical details and entertainment stuff. So now I'm going in and I'm going to start adding some red hits throughout the engine just to give it even added detail. Red is always a good color to add, where you want the eye to follow. So I'm thinking of, this might be an area, this kind of looks like maybe a spark plug wire, or, it's some type of wire that's going throughout the engine to carry the current to somewhere else, But definitely, my reference point for this is spark plug wires coming off of old engines. But just going in and just adding a few highlights even to the back area where I said that, I'm not focusing on a lot of detail back there, but just enough to give the eye to something to look at, so it doesn't look like just a big mess back there. Just add a few highlights and dark spots, and you create an area that's that you can tell something's going on back there. You may not know exactly, but it looks like it belongs there, and it's part of all the other mechanical details. And a lot of this is sort of going along the lines of, what's called indication, where you're not filling out specific details, but you're adding in, highlights and dark areas like I talked about, and just giving the illusion of stuff being there. And it's kind of a fun little process too. I enjoy doing the indication stuff, making it look like there's something there, but not entirely. So just adding some hot spots on those wires just to make them pop out a little bit more. And then as far as brushes and stuff I use in Painter, like I said, I've really limited my palette just to make it usable for myself. I do a lot of production work for, anything from the toy industry to video games. And I also do a lot of product design too. So when I'm actually designing stuff, I like to keep my workflow as fast as I can, because when you're doing freelance, you have to be very quick. And a lot of times your deadlines are very short. So the reason behind my palette is I don't have a ton of brushes in there so that I can keep my workflow really fast. And even on these demos, I probably spend a longer than I normally do on most of my production work. Partly because I'm rendering everything on here. A lot of times with my production stuff, I have photos that I've taken, and I'll use photo reference a little bit, like wheels and even engine areas. Even if I'm in a, the made-up engine, I'll use a little bit of photo reference and pop it in there from pieces of engine, and you kind of just group it together. Even though it looks sci-fi, you can still use pieces from existing engines and put it in there, and it'll give you a really quick indication of, an engine going, mechanical details and engines going on in there. And I've shown a little bit of that process through some of the other renderings I've done with using photo reference. In fact, I did that in my first book. I was showing how I use photo reference for laying in textures and panels and things like that on one of the cars I drew. So yeah, mostly what I use, I'd say my number one brush is definitely the pencils that I've created. And then the next is the marker. And then obviously the eraser is very handy. I have several different erasers. I have a hard edge, I have a soft edge. I even have a soft edge in there that's really a light touch eraser, so that you barely touch it and you can kind of fade out areas. And then I do have the digital airbrush in there, and I treat those brushes more like a typical Photoshop brush. So right now I'm going in and kind of doing some detail work on the cockpit area, and I colored that front window a little bit different color. It's actually not a see-through window. It's actually a like another piece of aluminum that's been bent into a window shape. It's kind of more of a windscreen. So I'm not making it see-through like a regular windshield. It's just like a riveted on windscreen. So I'm changing the color a little bit. And you'll see I'll put the highlights on it and stuff a little bit later and make it in there. Make it fit in there a little bit better so it belongs on that body. And then right now this is kind of a wing area that kind of pops out off the body, so I wanted to highlight it and make it look like it's facing upwards. And I'm going to go in here and add some highlights to that front window, or to that windscreen basically. Again, sometimes I have to mess around with these brushes because I'm still learning a lot about Painter 12, and since I've created my custom palette, I'm not using my existing brushes from the old painters and stuff, so I have to go in and kind of figure out my brushes again. It is a little bit of experimentation, but once you get this all dialed, your workflow can be pretty quick, especially when you use a limited palette like I have. And so where I'm putting my highlight there, you can see how the highlight runs down the shoulder of the vehicle, from that front to the viewer would be the front right hand corner. You can see that highlight, and I follow that all the way back to the windscreen back there, and then I carry the highlight onto the windscreen, following that whole highlighted area. So you can see it's starting to look like it's part of the body now, and it's not so much just a different color. So right now just going in and adding the little tiny rivet details as if it was riveted to the body. And then putting a slight dark area on there, as if because obviously if it's riveted on, you're going to have a panel line on there, because it's going to be a separate part. So I'm just adding in that darker area. Then you'd catch a highlight on the top of that metal. Where the edge is pointing up to the sky. Now I'm just going in and darkening some of that area on there. Basically it's the other side of the windscreen, and just making it darker to make his head pop out a little bit more, so that you can tell somebody's in there. So now I'm going to go back up to the front here and start focusing on these little details. You can see here I struggle a little bit with this front area because I don't like the way it looks. I wasn't totally happy with it. So I kind of go back and forth on detailing it and figuring out what looks best and what'll make it flow with the rest of the engine. So this is a part that I kind of left unfinished on my design, and a little bit of a mistake, because the thing is that this is one of those detailed parts that's first and foremost on the sketch, and I probably should have thought about it a little bit more before I went into to detail it all out. But you'll see I end up changing it around a few times here to try to get the correct look. And I'm also messing with perspective too. I realized my perspective was off there. So sometimes it's a back and forth process, and you know, some parts of the rendering will go really fast because you know exactly what you want it to look like. And then, you know, I wanted to leave this in there because just to show that, hey, you know, sometimes I struggle, and you know, I don't always get the thing that I want first time around. And just, you know, teaching other people out there that it's okay to struggle a little bit as a designer, and you know, to realize that you don't always have it dialed the first time you draw it down. Sometimes it's a trial and error process of figuring out what looks best, and you know, what your idea is, how to best convey it. I think that was another thing too, that I didn't have an idea of exactly what I wanted this to look like. So I was just drawing lines and putting details on there and figuring out what would fit the best. Sometimes you gotta walk away from it, come back and look at it again. See, right now you could tell the way I had drawn my perspective earlier that wasn't quite right. Now I've got it, definitely got it a little bit better now. I mean, I did know that this was kind of a small intake area for the engine to breathe. So I knew that triangular intake in the front, you know, was going to have a gap in it to make it look like it sucked in air. So just going in and, you know, like I said, just playing with the details, figuring out kind of what I like as far as the design, how it goes with the rest of the engine. You know, I've kind of got these repeating blocks on there that are almost like a ramp on there. So I was thinking of that towards the back of the scoop there, and adding those to my design. So going in and adding highlights to some of those details. Then I'm also adding some real faint highlights in there too, like you know, maybe they're hoses that are connected in there, little bits sticking out. You know, anytime you look at a mechanical part, it's got a lot of stuff. A really neat part to look at, I think, on an engine is the whole intake area, which is like a lot of times the carburetor, or if it's a newer car, it's like a fuel injection setup. So you have a lot of hoses and linkages and things going on in those, and it gives you a lot of neat detail. And it's detail that you don't have to draw exactly. You know, it's like I talked about earlier about doing that indication, where you're just indicating pieces in there. Then I'm bringing up these red wires again back into the front of the engine. Maybe that whole thing right there is sort of the distributor sitting up front, and it's connected into those wires there. So you can see how, if you do know a lot about engines and and the way they function and what pieces do, you can remanipulate them into, more of a fanciful type of engine like this. It's real crazy, but you may not know exactly what all the pieces do, but in my head I can kind of figure some of that stuff out, partly because I do have the knowledge of what an engine does and how it functions and how it's been built. To most people that have done engines and stuff, they may not think that, wow, that could be a distributor. Well, that's kind of weird. And it is, but it's also a sci-fi piece too. It's not based on real world. But if you apply that same thought process to your sci-fi stuff, it makes stuff look believable. So you can see I'm also adding a lot of rivets and bolts and things like that. When your engines are held together by a lot of bolts. And even if you look at all the World War II aircraft and things that I'm influenced by, a lot of mechanical details in that stuff. So you can see in this stage of the process, it starts to take a little bit longer because you're going in and doing fine detailing on these, mechanical areas, adding bolts, rivets, highlights to the edges, and, getting stuff to look like it really functions. So this is going to pretty much wrap up the first part of the rendering tutorial, and move on to the part 2 to see the final rendering, and I'll finish up all the details and get on highlights and starting to make it look like a completed piece. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.